My guest in this interview is Clare Cooper-Marcus. She is Professor Emerita of Architecture and Landscape Architecture at University of California at Berkeley, and the co-author of an important book with a chapter on gardens for people with Alzheimer's. And the book is called Therapeutic Landscapes, an evidence-based approach to designing healing gardens and restorative outdoor spaces, co-authored with Naomi Sachs. Welcome, Clare. I'd like to start, Clare, and I've known you for many years, and you've always had a very strong passion for landscape architecture, for gardens, for nature, and the importance of nature. Where did this passion come from? Why are you so passionate about this topic?
Well, it's a little bit personal in that nature was important in my childhood, but I think in terms of what we're talking about, it's an evolutionary memory of all humans, not so many generations ago, that we grew up in forests, in nature, and we have that somewhere buried beneath us, that we have a real need to relate to nature, and people with dementia no different from anyone else.
Would you say that the connection to nature is hardwired in our brains and bodies?
I think so, yes. Yes, we lived in it, and it provided us with shelter, probably with food, with water. It was our home. And so really living in buildings and driving cars and being inside structures is in evolutionary terms, is quite unnatural.
Is there something important about nature and to us physiologically?
For people with dementia in particular, being in nature, greenery, in the sunlight, has measurable effects of reducing levels of aggression, of improving sleep patterns, better immune function, and it has some kind of immeasurable spiritual benefits, I think, for all of us.
I think that's very important. Even you can't measure it. Spiritual qualities are so important. So if you were advising, as you have taught many landscape architects and written a lot of work about designing for people with dementia and designing gardens for people, elders in general, what are some of the high points that you would want to totally remind people to remember, that must be remembered in these kind of settings?
Well, thinking about a garden for a facility with people who have various forms of dementia, some of the basics would be that there be one entry from the building into the garden, that it leads onto a patio where perhaps some people will venture no further into the garden than that, and so an attractive place to sit, and from there a circular or figure-of-8 path around the garden, coming back to the single entry door so that people don't get lost. No forks in the road, no places where people have to make a decision, which can increase levels of aggression. And since some people, not all, with dementia may be quite frail, there should be a place to sit or to perch within sight of that entry patio, no more than 20 feet away.
Before you go on, what do you mean by perch?
Perch could be a retaining wall of a planting bed that is at 18 or 20 inches high, where you could just sort of lean and take a little rest, and hopefully maybe look sideways at some very interesting plants, details, succulents, etc.
Without having to sit down, stand up, which itself is an effort, right?
Yes, that's true. Though it is important to have a variety of seating with arms and backs, and some of it fixed seating and some of it movable, so that the staff could arrange it in some kind of situation where they organize a program. So as people wander around the garden, it's important that they see things that maybe remind them where they are, markers or landmarks in the garden. And as they enter the garden from the building, it's nice to have something visual as a destination or a goal. It could be a large tree with seating under it. It could be a gazebo, something where people immediately see it and head towards it.
Further into the garden, not right at the entrance.
No, further into the garden, perhaps at the furthest point of the garden. And it's very important that there be a great variety of planting material in the garden to keep people's attention, and some of it such that the staff might use as memory triggers.
What would a memory plant be?
So according to the location and the culture of this facility, it might be a plant, a flower that was popular during the childhood and youth of most of the residents. Or it could be a plant or a flower that is culturally significant, such as quince or plum blossom during Chinese New Year.
Let me ask you a question. Are plants in and out of fashion? So that something that it was fashionable in my childhood, orchids or daffodils or whatever, might not be so fashionable today, but you should look backwards?
Yes, definitely. I don't quite know why this is so, but plants do go in and out of fashion and differently in different parts of the world. So whoever is the landscape architect designing this garden, they should be aware of the plants that were available and popular during the youth of the residents. And it may entail finding old plant catalogs from that period and finding out what those plants were that were popular at that time, and finding some way to source them.
Huh. There's a lot of people who always talk about no poisonous plants. What is your view towards that?
So no poisonous plants. There's a very good website at Cornell University on poisonous plants. Also, I believe in Wikipedia. There are lots of plants that are listed as poisonous, but one should be a little, have not a sense of humor, that's not the right word. Some plants are listed as toxic, such as daffodils. However, someone would have to dig up a dozen daffodil bulbs and eat them to be poisoned.
So it's very important not to rid the garden of all beauty just because the bulbs might be poisonous if you eat a dozen.
Yes, but certain things like oleander are extremely poisonous, and if we're thinking about people in later stages of dementia, when it sometimes happens that people try to put some things in their mouth, then you'd certainly want to eliminate something that is definitely poisonous. The flowers are definitely poisonous. And I think eliminate any plants with strong thorns or anything hazardous, things that drop berries on the path that might be a slipping hazard in the autumn when they fall.
So what about, so what you're saying is don't leave all flowers out just because the bulbs might be poisonous, but be careful. So how does this affect the aesthetics of the garden? I mean, how important, or where does creativity and aesthetics and the beauty of the garden come in designing gardens for elders or gardens for people with dementia?
Well, the beauty of the garden should be similar to thinking about any garden, but in particular, if people are in a residential facility and this is the only outdoor space they have access to, then even more so that the landscape architect should be especially careful in providing a great variety of planting by shape of the leaves, by color of the flowers, by height, and things that move in a slight breeze that can be quite mesmerizing. So there's lots of ways to be creative, and I think an important thing to think about is a four-season garden. That is, that there's something flowering and interesting and colorful at every season of the year. And if we're talking about a location where there's a definite winter season, then the creativity should then focus on what can you see from the most commonly used interior space, the dining room or the day room. What can you see in winter? And is that fascinating and colorful? Because maybe in winter people cannot go outside.
You've used the word sensory delight. What does that mean? I've heard you use that term.
It means that there should be planting that people want to bend and touch, like lamb's ears. Planting that people want to smell. Roses are obvious one, but there's things like scented geranium where you have to rub a leaf between your fingers. Really thinking about all the senses of sight, of hearing, maybe hearing leaves being blown by a breeze, taste, by planting herbs and things like that in the garden that people are allowed to pick and that they recognize and they can pick and eat, or the staff may use in some kind of a program. So thinking about every sense that is a human sense.
So how do you implement and get these kinds of considerations to be included in the process? Is it just finding a landscape architect who knows about this stuff? Is it making sure they have a consultant? Is it what's the first thing you have to do to make sure that these kind of considerations are included?
I think it's very essential that we think about the architect and the landscape architect working together from the very beginning, because it's important that the garden be visible from the most highly used interior space of the facility, probably the dining room or a day room, and that people can see out even when seated, so that has an effect on window design. So the two things, the visibility of the garden and the windows and the location of that space, must be worked on together, which means those two professions need to work together. It must be a landscape architect who designs a garden. Architects are not trained sufficiently, or not trained at all, in horticulture and soils and all the things that a landscape architect knows. So it's important that there be a collaboration from the very beginning.
Some people would have used the term that the garden is like another common space just without a roof, so it needs to be incorporated into the plan in that way. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would. And I think too that initial design process must include representatives of the management and staff of the facility, so that they buy into the design, that we get their input, what they would like to see, or that they understand some of the research that the landscape architect and the architect may bring forth, and that they understand how important it is that the residents have access into the garden, and that they don't keep the door locked so that people can't go out.
How do they know how do they get to know, how do they find out about the usefulness and the objectives that the garden was planned for?
I think it would be important that the landscape architect and architect, but particularly the landscape architect, if we're talking about a garden, has a written program that actually details why they did certain things in the design. that this isn't always done. In fact, frequently not done. It's verbally expressed in meetings. It's not written down. Important that it be written down and become what you might call a user's manual, so that the staff who come subsequently to work in that facility, who weren't there in the beginning, can read something and say, oh, I understand why we need to keep the door open. Oh, I see the whole garden was designed to be safe for the residents, so I can let people go out without worry.
Yes, yes. You know, you would never buy a harvester, $1 million harvester for a big farm without being instructed on how to use it and having a user manual.
Exactly, yes.
So why over the years, we've been doing this for decades, you've been doing this for a long time as well, why is it that this isn't, everything you're saying is not just common knowledge among everybody making a garden, or every architect, or every operator? What's the barrier to acceptance?
Well, I think it's very complex. I think partly it is how designers are taught. They're taught to push the envelope, to be extremely creative and do something no one's ever done before, and therefore it doesn't necessarily gain them points, if you want to put it that way, to go and find out about research. Very often design teachers are not they're not knowledgeable themselves about the research, and they don't push students to look for it. And that then translates into how a design business or design firm works, that people take designs from precedents or from their own, their creativity. They don't see the need to look for research. And so we get situations where the garden really doesn't work, and or the management, the client of this facility, may not know that there is research that should be looked at.
Uh-huh. So if an Alzheimer's association in South America, or on the African continent, or in Australia, or in China or Japan, would want to incorporate the kind of issues that you are suggesting, it has to also include be included in design education. So to the developers, to the developers and the operators.
Yes, exactly. If they know about it and they say, here's the research, we want you to use this in designing this facility and its garden, then I think it will be used. So I think the best way is to get this to the developers and the clients of these facilities.
Clare, this has been very illuminating, and I think as part of this important report, having your focus on the garden and also on this thinking is vital. I'd like to ask one last question, and now that I'm thinking about it, I might ask it of each of the interviewees and produce some posters. If you were given the opportunity to design a poster, only one, that would hang in the wall about garden design in developers' offices, operators' offices, management offices, staff offices, and architects' offices, and landscape architects' offices, what would that poster say?
Oh, very difficult to in one sentence, but I think it would say, remember to design for the person using this garden.
As simple as that?
Yes.
Clare, that is brilliant, and I want to thank you for participating and for putting up with all these questions, and your message is vital. Could you hold up your book, Therapeutic Landscapes, so people could see that? So this is the reference book. If people are interested, they can continue by getting a copy and reading the book, or getting online, or however one can get this going. Just to give you a plug, it's published by John Wiley and Sons in 2014 in New Jersey. Thank you so much, Clare.